With Lululemon, the real gift happens when they're living in it. When you give the fan favorite everywhere belt bag, the real gift is... And when the ultra-soothing Rest Feel slides are the gift, you're really giving them... This holiday, Lululemon makes it easy to give little luxuries that go beyond. Open the moment. Shop now at Lululemon.com.
His code name's Jackal. He's an exceptional assassin.
Streaming now on Peacock.
He will kill again, unless we stop him.
Academy Award winner Eddie Redmayne.
You're paying me to kill him. I am charging you for getting away.
The Jackal's here. Look at the exits.
BAFTA Award winner Lashana Lynch.
I will find him, and I will kill him myself. I like to win.
So do I.
The Day of the Jackal. Streaming now, only on Peacock.
Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Welcome back to our series about historical counterfactuals, and today we are doing one of the biggest what-ifs of them all. What if Franz Ferdinand had survived that day in Sarajevo in June 1914? I'm talking to the historian Chris Clark, author of Sleepwalkers, the definitive history of the origins of the First World War, about how it could, maybe, have been different. There is so much to talk about here that this conversation comes in two parts. And part one today is about the assassination itself. Chris, the summer of 1914 is in many ways the motherlode of counterfactual history. It's the beginning of the event that changed everything, and yet it feels so contingent, so fragile. The history of it feels so accidental. And in Sleepwalkers, your magisterial account of the origins of the First World War, I was very struck by the fact that you wrestled with the counterfactual question and how much weight one should put on it. It's halfway through your telling. So I'm just going to read you the bit. I'm looking at my Kindle here. So this is at 51% of the book. So we're pretty much exactly halfway through. We're sort of in the middle of July at some point. And you say, we have to be careful not to replace the problem of overdetermination with one of underdetermination of a war without causes. And I quote, "Important as it is to understand that this war might easily not have happened, and why, this insight has to be balanced with an appreciation of how and why it did, in fact, happen." So before we get into all of the twists and turns, what if the car had turned left, not right? What is your sense when you think about it now of the weight, the balance between the overdetermination and underdetermination issue? Because it's the war that might not have happened, but it is the war that changed everything. How do you wrestle with that?
I think this is a question which is never satisfactorily resolved. I can't imagine how one would resolve it. As soon as you say that A caused B, as soon as you make a causal assertion, you imply a counterfactual. You imply an alternative universe where A didn't happen, and as a result, B didn't happen. And if the material you're dealing with is not a chemical reaction that you can keep reproducing in the laboratory, but a one-off sequence of events that we call history with a capital H, that we can't rerun, then we'll never be able to test those assumptions. So there remains something ineluctable, something very elusive about the answer to that question about the balance between a contingency and determination. And so in a way, I think it's a fool's errand, and we probably shouldn't try and resolve it. But we do need to be aware of counterfactuals, not least because contemporaries were. I mean, they were thinking about people who made decisions. Of course, as decision makers ought to, also thought about, what will happen if I do such and such a thing? They also weighed that up against the possibility of what would happen if they didn't, or if they did another thing. They were very conscious in that way. So they were constantly running counterfactual scenarios in their own mind, although they didn't think of them as counterfactual because the factual hadn't yet been established. They hadn't done what they were going to do, but they did think in terms of alternative future scenarios. So we do need to be aware of counterfactuality, and we do need to be aware of the larger structural causes bearing down on these people, the constraints on their freedom of action, which in some cases were invisible to them and in other cases not. So we need to think about these decisions both in terms of individual acts of will and of cognition and discernment, but also as responses to larger structural or systemic pressures.
Particularly with this case, with the First World War, reading your account of it, rereading it, I was really struck by the way in which, as you say, they're all hyper-conscious of the next step and, as it were, the decision tree and how it unfolds in a very different way. And at the same time, a lot of them are operating under conditions of either implicit or explicit fatalism. These are people who are very conscious of their own ability to shape events and often believing that there's a set of forces at work that go beyond their capacity to shape events. I mean, this may be true of all important points in history, that the key actors have a sense of agency and fatalism, but it feels particularly acute in the summer of 1914. Have I misread it?
No, I think that's true. And I think it was, I think you're right on the other hand that, an awareness of contingency has been part of decision-making, certainly throughout modernity. I mean, I think it weighs more heavily in some decision-makers' minds than in others, but it's certainly been a feature of modernity that people think in terms of, they think of themselves firstly as decision-makers. That is a modern way of thinking about what states people do. And secondly, that they run through alternative scenarios and so on has been a feature of modernity in general. But I think in 1914 it's particularly intense. And I think one reason for that is the opacity, the illegibility of the system, that people found it very difficult to predict each other's behavior. They found it very difficult to read the behavior of other executives. And the reason for that was that these executives were behaving in very secretive, often opaque, and unpredictable ways. Nobody really knew who was making policy in Russia, for example. Was it the Tsar? Probably not, but sometimes he did seem to dip an oar in. Was it someone like Sukhomlinov, the chief of the general staff? Was it Sazonov, the foreign minister, a kind of very vacillating man, a difficult man to read? Or was it any one of a countless array of other possible contributors to decision-making processes? And in Austria-Hungary, you had a kind of a bee swarm of potential decision-makers, all contributing in a highly chaotic way to processes of discernment and decision-making. And the situation was no different in Berlin. Famously, Berchtold, the foreign minister in Vienna, asked the question, who rules in Berlin? Everybody wanted to know that too. Was it the Kaiser? Was it Bettmann Hollweg? Was it Jago? Was it the Moltke, the chief of the general staff? But people were asking the same questions about Britain. I mean, was Grey really going to be the one who made British policy, or would he be overridden by the radical opposition to his liberal imperialist policy? Who in Britain would ultimately have the say when push came to shove? So this kind of illegibility meant that levels of uncertainty were very high, levels of trust were very low, even among allies, incidentally. I mean, of course, levels of trust were very low between the different alliance blocks. Not that there were alliance blocks, but between the two loose constellations, the Central Powers and the powers that would later be known as the Entente powers, levels of trust were low, but they were low within these blocks as well. The British didn't trust the Russians. They were full of, anguished angst about what Russia was going to do next. And so the distrust and the uncertainty were everywhere. And I think that is why we see these people groping for decisions, imagining having to think through every possible consequence and having to think of decisions in the plural rather than always knowing how to respond to very clear provocations, for example, or clear encouragements.
And yet there are also moments where their response to the opacity is to fall back on an idea that there is something called Russia or there is something called France, and to characterize the system that they're dealing with in these very generic national terms, and to have a view not just of the minute detail of if I do this, they'll do that, and if they do this, I'll do that. But there's some sweep of history that's at work here and some forces that are at work that transcend the question of who decides, because in the end, Russia will do X or Russia will do Y. We'll come on to this. The Germans had a view that a German-Russian conflict was inevitable, regardless of the little steps that might be taken. And so that's part of the tension here too, that hyper-awareness that you're dealing with a mysterious, foggy decision-making process in a whole range of different national settings. And then at the back of their minds for a lot of these people, a sort of sweeping grand view of history and national destiny and identity and honor and all of those broad nebulous categories that transcend the decision steps.
Yes, That's absolutely right. And I think there I'd say two things. And one is that in conditions of uncertainty of the kind in which statesmen were operating at that time, one way of handling that is to devise or fashion narratives of inevitability. And this is something that political decision makers often do. They often say, we're doing this because we have to. There is no alternative. What the Germans called Alternativlosigkeit, alternativelessness, is often a feature of the arguments that politicians make for what they have decided to do or what they've chosen to do. But they quickly turn choice into necessity. It's a psychic device which relieves them from responsibility for what they're about to do, or psychological device, perhaps to put it better. I think the second point is that, and I think your point about identity, Russia will do this, this is who we are, is also important. Decision-making theorists distinguish between choosing decisions and opting decisions. Choosing decisions are one where we weigh up the advantages and costs of a particular line of action. Opting decisions are decisions where we make a major, they're sort of naked acts of will, which have to do with our identity, who we think we are. So, for example, people who chose Brexit made an opting decision. They chose Brexit because they thought this is who we are. We're a free island nation. And people who opposed Brexit in general made a choosing decision. We think this will cost us more than it will bring us, and we think it will be damaging to this, that, and the other thing, and so on. So I think in 1914, choosing situations often mutated into opting ones. And I think it's very important what you say that, in the end, many of the key decisions made in 1914 weren't actually about the very careful weighing up. They were, in the end, a kind of naked act of will. We're going to step into the darkness, and come what may, we will do what we as Russians, Germans, Frenchmen, Britons have to do.
Right, let's get to it. Excuse me. Again, I'm so excited about getting to Sarajevo. I almost lost my voice. Right, let's get to it. It is, as I said, the motherlode of counterfactuals, but there are two kinds of counterfactuals, and we're going to do them both. And the appeal of them, I think, is clear. So there are two things about the origins of the First World War, which means the tantalizing nature of what happened, given what we know the long-term consequences were, bring people back again and again to thinking about how it might have been different. So one is simply about what happened in Sarajevo, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. And when one sees, as in your book, we get in intricate detail how that unfolded, one can't help thinking, God, it could have been different. It feels like an accident. And we'll talk about that. What if the bullets had missed? What if the plot had failed? Given assassination plots so often did fail, which is in itself quite an interesting feature of the time, how often they missed. It seemed to be quite hard to hit your target. The second set of counterfactuals follow from the fact that it did happen. And from there to a month and a bit later, all of the major belligerents are at war. And the steps along that path that you map out so brilliantly, and the feeling that a different step along the way might have changed the outcome. So we've got what the world would be like if Franz Ferdinand had survived that day. And then we've got how, given he didn't survive that day, might nonetheless the catastrophe have been avoided. But let's do the first one first. What if the bullets had missed? What's your sense of how one should think about the accidental nature of that assassination? So when one reads about it in your book, in many other accounts, it's an extraordinary day, that day, and it feels so contingent. And one of the reasons it feels so contingent is he himself or the people around him, Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a very important person, needed protection, goes into the belly of the beast. It's a dangerous thing to do. They're so cavalier about it. There's something so bizarrely fatalistic, in a way, about the way in which the lead actors on this day, which was going to change the history of the world, behaved. How do you feel about that day? Does it feel to you like an accident, or does it have any sense of predestination about it?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, Rebecca West, who wrote a wonderful book about the sort of Balkan hinterland to the First World War, she was a sort of Balkanophile, loved that part of the world. And she was very Austriophobe, and commenting on the visit to Sarajevo by Franz Ferdinand and his wife, she said, the dumpy bodies of the Archduke and his frumpy wife sucked the bullets out of the unwilling revolvers of the assassins, as if somehow, they went there, in the hope of being shot. I mean, it's a sort of a jeu d'esprit by Rebecca West, and, it's enjoyable to read. But, of course, that takes us very, very far from the way people actually felt about this visit. One thing we have to remember is a very banal fact, and that is that Sarajevo was inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was actually a domestic location. It wasn't like they'd gone out to some sort of far orbit of the solar system where there are cowboys running around or whatever. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Yes, it was on the periphery, but it had been occupied by Austria-Hungary since 1878. It had been annexed and organically part of the empire since 1908. There'd been a huge amount of inward investment. The city had been transformed by huge architectural projects financed by the regime and by sort of private-public partnerships. It was a very handsome city. It was run by a Bosniak Muslim elite, which was pro-Habsburg. The Croats, who were another important minority, were also, broadly speaking, pro-Habsburg. The Serbs were a different question. Bosnian Serbs were ambivalent or hostile, but, they were only part of that population. So that's part of it. This is a location inside the empire. Yes, in retrospect, the security was ludicrously poor. There was no spalier, there was no sort of, long line of soldiers flanking the path into the center of the town and so on. I mean, partly that was to do with the fact that visits of this kind were not very common. You also need a sort of security system to be in place already. You can't just improvise these things on the day. And certainly Franz Ferdinand was not the man to have done that. He was someone who was very impatient with security arrangements. He was quite confident that things would go well. He felt very comfortable in the city. He was very drawn to it because it was he saw it as an oriental place, beautiful bazaar, very interesting bazaar district with lots of oriental carpets and other oriental things that he liked. In fact, he'd already visited the city a couple of days beforehand without any mishap. So he had no reason, sort of incognito, although he didn't at the time realize that he was being shadowed by none other than Gavrilo Princip, who would be his assassin on a couple of days later. So these are some of the reasons why he felt confident enough to do this. And in retrospect, we know that the security was inadequate. We also know that it's clear that the behavior of the Archduke was foolish in the sense that, even after he'd been attacked by a young man who threw a bomb, Nedeljko Chobodinovich, who threw a bomb as his car passed down the Appel Quay into the heart of the city, the bomb went wide and he may himself have batted it away from the car. It's not clear. And it exploded under another car and injuring an officer quite, with superficial cuts, and also incidentally incising a small cut in the cheek of his wife. So she was sort of bleeding from this small wound in her face. At that point, you'd think, he would have said, look, there are assassins in the city, we will leave. And in fact, somebody did ask the governor who was responsible for security arrangements, Potiorek, they said, is there going to be a further attack on His Highness? To which Potiorek replied, what, do you think Sarajevo was full of assassins? To which it was a rhetorical question, but the true answer was, in fact, yes, it was indeed full of assassins because there were 7 young men who had been deployed to do this. So Chobodinovich was only one of them. And so, it was crazy for him not to retire at high speed at that point. But there again, it's a question of character. I mean, he said, look, this man's clearly insane. He should be sent to a lunatic asylum. But when people said, Your Highness, I think we should leave now, he said, look, don't be ridiculous, and so on. It was then a kind of game of chicken. I'm not going to be cowed by this. I'm not going to be cowed by this random, chaotic violence. Let's move on and carry on. It was a very important day for him because he was coming to the city with his wife. He was an awkward figure in the Habsburg system. He was only the heir apparent because the son of the emperor had died under tragic circumstances by suicide, and that overshadowed his relationship with the reigning emperor, Franz Josef. It was awkward also because he'd married the wrong woman. He'd married a woman from perfectly decent Czech noble lineage, but not up to the very extravagant requirements of Habsburg royalty, and therefore who wasn't well seen and wasn't received and didn't occupy the place in the orders of precedence that one might have expected her to do. And so to be together in Sarajevo meant to be far away from Vienna and to have the chance to officiate together as husband and wife, as a couple. And it was their wedding anniversary, incidentally, as well. So he was thinking of other things. He wasn't just thinking about, the issue of safety, the question of Serbian resentments of the Habsburg monarchy. As we all do, he had a flurry of other stuff going on in his head. And he was an impatient man who didn't like taking advice. And these things all formed into a kind of, fatal cocktail on that day.
Yeah, as you say, what makes it so tantalizing is that they tried and failed. And Franz Ferdinand and his entourage carried on. It's as though the recent assassination attempt on Trump, like what you just described, a little flesh wound to the face, but he's hustled off. It's as though he'd carried on with his speech, and then 20 minutes later, someone else had shot him. And with hindsight, people would think, and the world would have changed. Had Trump been shot, we would now be living in a different world. And the fact that there was a dry run that failed, and they were meant to drive out by a different route, and something went wrong in communicating with the driver. So there's also a kind of haphazard, accidental, Mr. Bean-like quality to the day as well. But it makes it so tantalizing.
It does. But I mean, on the other hand, quite a lot of redundancy was built into the assassination in the sense that, there was more than just one. I mean, Chabrinovich could fail, and that still left several, the others were standing there along the same route. The reason they didn't fire was because they had lost their nerve. I mean, a couple of them ran away or collapsed or froze because they thought a policeman had approached them from behind and so on. Very understandable. I mean, how many young men, even those young men who are willing to act in this role, in the knowledge that it will cost them their own lives sooner or later, will actually be able to act when the moment comes. And I've never attempted such a thing and I never will, but one can only imagine that it's a supreme test of will and courage. And a number of them failed it. But of course, Gavrilo Princip didn't. He remained calm. He saw that it wasn't over yet. The game wasn't over. And then amazingly, by this fluke, they stuck to the original plan because no one had thought to the original departure plan, that is. They moved along the pre-planned route, which had been announced in the press, because someone forgot to tell the Czech driver. They'd talked about it in front of the Czech driver, but no one had translated the decision to change the route into Czech. And as a result, he drove up in the direction of the Bazaar district, which is where the Archduke wanted to go because he loved that district, and past the general store in front of which Gavrilo Princip was standing, and where he was able to take his 2 shots at point-blank range. So yes, there's a lot of fluke in this story, but there's also quite a lot of redundancy in the presence of, more than one young man, some with bombs or grenades is probably a better description of what they were carrying, some with revolvers, standing there in the various locations. So it is fluky, but it's also quite well planned.
That was what I was going to ask, which is how do you think about the conspiracy? Because it does appear in 2 different lights, depending on what sort of how you squint at it. 7 young men, some of them are almost children. It's been organized, but it's been organized in a pretty haphazard way. And as you say, all of them bar one fail at this. They either run away, the bomb misses. And it is one of these features of late 19th, early 20th century politics. I don't mean to joke about it, but there were many, many assassination attempts. And it's amazing how often someone gets close to the person they're trying to assassinate with a gun or a bomb and fails at this. It turns out it's harder than it looks. You've really got to get close up. And it has a sort of Keystone's Cop quality to it. But seen from another light, it is a ruthless conspiracy. Like you say, redundancy built into it, 7 of them. It worked because though most of them failed, one of them succeeded. And it wasn't just 7 haphazard, random young men. This was organized, and it had roots that went fairly deep into the Serbian political and military establishment. So it's not like an event. I don't mean to bring everything back to Trump's would-be assassin. We don't know what went on there, but there are these random acts where someone who is essentially a lone wolf of one kind or another either does or doesn't succeed. This is not one of those. This feels like something that's enmeshed into a far wider web of political intrigue and potential violence, to the extent that maybe had this one failed, it wasn't the end of the story. It wasn't like you stopped the lone wolf and you've nipped in the bud the point where history would have changed. So when you look at the conspiracy, do you see Keystone Cops, or do you see a web of intrigue that was going to ensnare Europe in this part of the world sooner or later?
Well, the Keystone Cops view was in a way part of the account of the assassination, which served the purposes of the Entente. The purposes of the Entente were to show this was just a sort of locally organized, very rubbishy, chaotic thing. The Austrians shouldn't have got too excited about it. They should simply have thought, well, bad stuff happens, let's move on.
Especially in the Balkans, bad stuff happens in the Balkans.
He said bad stuff happens in the Balkans. He probably shouldn't have gone there anyway. We didn't really like him very much. We liked his wife even less. And so, good riddance, let's move on. That was the sort of general view of the matter taken by the Entente powers. And it's astonishingly long-lived in the literature, this notion that actually it was fluky and badly organized and ultimately didn't really matter. And so we should sort of airbrush Sarajevo and the entire Balkan hinterland of Sarajevo out of the picture and think instead about, the great power interactions, about Germany's determination to use any possible pretext for war, etc., etc. In fact, I think that's a grave misreading of the Sarajevo assassinations. I mean, and there were two after all. Both of them were killed, not just him. I think that the event was deliberately freighted with the maximum in symbolic charge. I mean, the selection of the date was one important thing. This was Vidovdan. It was St. Vitus's Day, a very important day in the national calendar of the Serbs, among other things, because it was the anniversary recalling the Battle of Kosovo Polje, the Field of Blackbirds, of 1389, in which, at least according to the kind of archive of Serbian collective memory, a vast Serbian army was defeated by a vast Ottoman army. In fact, the composition of the two armies was a bit more complicated, but nevertheless, the story of 1389 was the breaking of Serbian power by the Ottomans and the end of the dream of a greater Serbian Reich. And if you add to that the fact that in the two Balkan wars of incredible violence, which had taken place in 1912 and 1913, so still very fresh in the memory of all the Balkan states, and in which there'd been an incredible bloodletting, among others, of Serbian youth who died in tremendous numbers in this conflict, that in the Second Balkan War, Kosovo Polje had once again been brought into the orbit of Serbia through the expansion of Serbia southwards. And so it was as if a very ancient history had come back into immediate proximity of the present. And national feeling was riding very, very high. And national feeling in Serbia meant, among other things, irredentism, an interest in the unredeemed lands of Serbdom, which had once belonged to the great empire of Stepan Dusan, but had been lost after the Field of Blackbirds. They were soon going to be retrieved. This was the feeling that the restoration of Serbian fortunes was imminent. So that day was a very powerful, a symbolically powerful day that made the spark more than just a spark. There was something explosive in this plan if it was going to work. And secondly, as you say, it had roots in the Serbian establishment. This is not to say that it would be wrong to say that the assassination was an act by the Serbian state. It wasn't. If the Serbian state was a complex structure, as all states are, the Prime Minister Pasic was very hostile to this kind of irredentist activity. He was very hostile to the Black Hand, which was the network most closely involved with this kind of thing, and very concerned when he learned, as he did, that a number of young men had crossed the Drina border with explosives and revolvers manufactured in Serbia, going into Austrian Bosnia-Herzegovina. He was very, very concerned about that. And he was in a difficult standoff with the chief of Serbian military intelligence, a man known as Apis, though his real name was Dmitrijevic, who was the sort of architect of this kind of irredentist activity that had been going on for some time. So there's a problem there with saying, Serbia is at fault in this. That is not the case. But what is true is that parts of the Serbian apparatus are complicit in this, and that you have a sort of quasi-runaway intelligence department basically running its own operations. And that is part of the complexity of 1914. So, in other words, the event is a major event. And of course, its victim is a person of tremendous importance. You've touched on that as well, but it's a point perhaps one doesn't need to make in Britain, which is a monarchy, but sometimes needs to be made in Republican contexts, that the heir to the throne is, in a biological sense, the future of the polity. And Franz Ferdinand was a man of tremendous energy. The existing emperor was extremely old. Nobody could remember when he hadn't been emperor. I mean, he'd been on the throne since 1848, believe it or not. So he's a very, very elderly man. Not much is heard from him. He'd always been a rather laconic figure. This new man is very energetic, has plans for the empire, wants to restructure it. So in lots of ways, this is a power-packed event, super determined, both with symbolic freight and also with political consequence.
What did the conspirators, maybe not Princip himself and the people who fired the shots, but the people behind them, what did they think, were this to succeed, it would achieve? How did they see the map of the future unfolding with Franz Ferdinand dead?
It's very hard to reconstruct that because Dmitrijevic, Apis, regularly burned his papers. He kept there are no paper trails. These are highly secretive organizations that operate through small cellular modules and so on. Even Pasic, the prime minister, regularly burned his papers. So it's very difficult to reconstruct people's plans in as much as they formulated them. But I think there are several thoughts. One is that, a successful act of this kind, which should also be deniable, because you could always say, well, these are Bosnian citizens. They're just unhappy with what the Austrians have been doing. It's nothing to do with us. You could hope that the links with Serbia would not be discovered. So that was part of it. And it was assumed that the young men would take their own lives. They were given cyanide powder with which to commit suicide. So there were suicide assassins in that sense, a non-trivial sense. So it was expected they would take their own lives and that they would thus be unable to provide the police with any incriminating information. That, in fact, didn't work out, because although a couple of them tried to take their poison, it didn't work. And the others didn't even try. And pretty quickly, the Austrians formed a fairly full picture of what had happened. So their plan was, I think, that a successful escapade like this would be a signal to people across the Balkans that Austrian power was vulnerable, that the time to rise up against it was soon. I think they probably imagined the possibility of a larger conflict, but Pašić had been thinking for some time, and he wasn't alone in this. This was a widely held, widely shared thought in parts of the Serbian elite, that Serbia was unlikely to achieve its objectives in peacetime. It was hard to imagine how anything but a major war would create the kind of potential to reshuffle the European system to the extent that the redemption of lost, as the Serbs saw it, the redemption of lost Serbian lands would become possible, which would mean the acquisition of the South Slav areas of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and their annexation to Serbia, to the Serbian state. So they were probably thinking about all those different things, though exactly with what assigning which priorities to which is impossible to reconstruct.
So I'm going to ask you the first of the what if questions here, which is, it's not hard to imagine the circumstances in which the Czech driver got the memo and took the right turning, or even though they went on the original route, Gavrilo Princip wasn't standing in the right place, or he missed. There are so many occasions in this era where assassins get very close and miss. And Franz Ferdinand drives out of Sarajevo, and the day is remembered as a failed assassination attempt. And no doubt there would have been recriminations. The Austrians would still have wanted to know what the hell had been going on and who was behind it and so on. But the heir to the imperial throne is intact. He and his wife remember their wedding anniversary for the rest of their lives. So what then happens? Because, again, all of these things have this dual character. It feels like, given that wasn't what happened and they were both killed, the timing was particularly acute or unfortunate. There was a sort of window in which the world could fall apart in the summer of 1914. And had that window been missed, the shifting alliances, the great power alliances, were very unstable. Or maybe unstable is the wrong word. They were very sort of fungible. You can squeeze them and you get a different outcome. So the things that were going to become facts about the world, Anglo-German rivalry and military contest, it might only have taken a few months for détente between Britain and Germany to break out, or the French-Russian alliance, would it have held? Is there a scenario in which this assassination attempt fails and the structures that seem to be locked in the summer of 1914, quite quickly the plates start moving again, and whatever future conflict is going to arise in Europe, and maybe there would have been one, it wouldn't have been anything like this one?
Absolutely. I mean, the only way in which you could rule out that kind of, speculative thinking would be if you knew that the war were already planned, that there was somebody who already intended to bring the war about. And there has been a small number of German scholars who took the view, following Fritz Fischer, that the Germans had planned a war and were going to bring one about anyway. However, it's widely agreed that the evidence for this is just simply absent. There isn't any evidence for it. There's a meeting which has been misread as a planning meeting. In fact, it was something else entirely. So if we can put that to one side and assume that there is no state which is planning, come what may, whether there's a provocation or an upset or not, to wage war on its fellows, then can we get through the summer of 1914 without a war? That's the really interesting thing, if the assassination doesn't succeed. And it seems to me that we probably can. I mean, the first thing to bear in mind is that there's nothing really accidental about the fact that this was a Balkan crisis. The Balkans, and it's easy to establish that, the Balkans were already, they're a kind of structural gap in the European system because they're part of this, they're in the sort of interface, the sort of no man's land between the Ottoman, the Russian and the Austrian empires. And that Ottoman role is really important because the Ottomans had been shut out of the European system since the Vienna Congress of 1815. This is a point that the historian Paul Schrader made, that, there's a structural hole in the system over the Balkans, like a kind of political ozone hole over the Balkan Peninsula. So that's part of the reason why the Balkans matter. So if the crisis happens somewhere else, like Morocco, or some ships collide in the North Sea or something like that, it's not necessarily going to have the trigger effect of the Balkan crisis of 1914. Another thing is that a tripwire effect had been built into the Franco-Russian alliance, which had steadily focused more and more on the danger of a Balkan upset, a Balkan crisis of some kind, though nobody knew what form this crisis would take. And the French and the Russians had already agreed that in the event of there being a further Balkan crisis, then the French would stand by the Russians if the Russians felt impelled to intervene, whether or not Russia was itself actually under attack. So there are tripwires and there are triggers, but they're very localized. They're very focused on the Balkans. So if you can get through the summer of 1914 without the Sarajevo crisis, maybe you can make it into the next year without a major conflagration. And that is where the situation that you just mentioned, the sort of fluxiness of the international system, comes into play, because, none of these powers was certain of its allies, the future behavior of its allies, and with good reason. The Russians were very worried about what would happen if Poincaré, for example, currently president of France, formerly foreign minister in 1912, what would happen if Poincaré fell from power, which is very much on the cards? What would happen if his successor was more responsive to the promptings of the French socialist left, for example? What would happen, the French wondered, if in Russia an anti-war faction were to come back into power again? Nobody knew really who was running the show in Russia. But what if the power changed hands, or power slipped, as it was constantly doing, from one faction to another? And there's one example that I remember being very, very struck by, which was that, when a Bulgarian delegation came to speak to Sazonov, the Russian foreign minister, about their concern that the Russians seemed to be in bed with the Serbs. Of course, the Bulgarians hated the Serbs. And this Bulgarian delegation asked Sazonov, why are you cozying up to Belgrade? What about us? Right? We're the traditional friends of the Russians. Why have you abandoned us? And Sazonov said, don't take it so seriously. We're in bed with Belgrade now, but next year it could all be different. Right? This is just a passing thing. We're talking to the Serbs right now, but wait and see. And I think he wasn't just palming them off. I think he was genuinely believed, as many people did, that the future was very, very open. And a Russia less fixated on Belgrade, a Russian policy less imbricated in the situation in Belgrade and more focused on Sofia, for example, or on Romania, might have played out very differently.
And as you say, the tripwire seemed to be set in the Balkans. An equivalent confrontation somewhere else would not necessarily have produced war. And that's not just hypothetical. There was a confrontation over Morocco in 1911. At the time, the press would always hype these things up and there was talk of war. But the system held, and in fact, the system seemed to work quite well in making sure that people didn't step over the brink. That was a German-French confrontation. But when you place the 1911 war fever moment alongside 1914, it makes 1914 look like it was the perfect storm. And that was what was required to blow this system up, because other kinds of conflicts could be accommodated in the system.
Absolutely. I mean, the comparison between Morocco and Sarajevo is a very instructive one because, 1911, as you say, it's a peace war crisis. There's a lot of very belligerent gesturing going on, and not just the French, incidentally. The British join with the French and warn the Germans off. The original provocation, I think it's not unfair to say, is a French one. It starts with efforts by France to deepen its hold on Morocco in breach of international agreements to which Germany, among other states, is a signatory. The Germans protest and make a fuss and so on. There's a kind of a game of chicken in which, angry notes are exchanged and so on. But then everybody pulls back from the brink. And one of the reasons why Morocco cannot become a major conflagration is that the Russians intervene at this point and say to the French, I think you should be aware that we do not see Morocco as a place in which fundamental French interests are at stake. So we do not see Morocco as a casus belli. We would not intervene on France's side in a struggle ignited by Morocco. And this was Russia's payback for an earlier situation, 1908, the Bosnian crisis, when the Austrians had annexed Bosnia in complex circumstances we don't have time to go into. But in the 1908/9 Bosnian annexation crisis, the Russians got very exercised about Bosnia. This is precisely the space in which the Sarajevo crisis would later break out. And in that context, the French had, sagely reminded the Russians that we do not see vital Russian interests at play in the Bosnian crisis, and therefore we would not be willing to see a military conflict that were to begin out of this crisis. We would not see that as a casus belli for our alliance. So in other words, it's exactly as you say, that in the situation of 1908-9, which is the Bosnian crisis, and 1911, which is the second Moroccan crisis, in those two situations, it turns out that the Franco-Russian alliance is actually a kind of safeguard against war. It's functioning as what alliance theorists or IR theorists call a tethering alliance. It's really designed to hold the two powers together rather than to goad them into a conflict. But the character, the kind of chemistry of the alliance changes precisely after Morocco in 1911-12, partly under the pressure of the Balkan Wars, and also of the Réveil National, as it's called, the French national revival, and partly as a result of the arrival of Poincaré, first as a very combative figure, first as foreign minister, and then as president of the Republic. And in that context, the meaning of this alliance is changed. It becomes less defensive and more aggressive, less tethering, and more tending to sort of assure the two partners that, in particular, that France will stand by Russia in the event of a crisis in the Balkans in which Russia feels obliged to intervene, regardless of whether Russia itself is under attack or not. So that allows a war to break out. I think of this as a kind of war of Balkan inception. That creates a scenario in advance in which people are prepared to swallow their doubts. The French are prepared to swallow their doubts about a Russian intervention in the Balkans and to look away from the question of how exactly this intervention takes place or on what grounds it's deemed to be necessary.
I want to ask you one more question about the what if the assassination hadn't happened before we get on to the what ifs, given that it did. And that's, there are many rival interpretations of the deep causes of the First World War, but one that comes across the political spectrum but is particularly associated with Marxist historians is this is a war of imperial competition. And the conventional Marxist views there was going to be a conflict between these capitalist empires as they competed for markets in Africa or elsewhere. But as you've just described it, the Moroccan conflict, which would have been a classic version of that, here are imperial powers competing for a greater foothold in Africa, didn't produce that. Something about the Balkan context was distinctively volatile. It does, as you said, include the Ottoman Empire and its lingering legacy in that part of the world as part of the equation. We are talking about the Russian Empire. We're talking about the key actors in these different imperial states seeing deep interconnections between what might happen in one part of Europe or indeed one part of the world and its knock-on effects in other places too. There was a lot of anxiety, notwithstanding the fact this was a Serbian crisis, about its implications for competition in relation to Turkey and access to the seas and naval power and all the rest of it. Is it fundamentally, in your view, the tripwire here, a tripwire of imperial competition?
I think imperialism is present in the behavior of all these states. The high imperialist era of the sort of 1890s and early 20th century, it's a period of very aggressive predation worldwide. And clearly that's part of the sort of ambient setting for the interaction between these powers. But if you look at, there are 2 points to be made there, or sort of countervailing, or several countervailing points that one ought to make, it seems to me. One is that in many ways, this problem of resolving the relations between the powers in their various colonial or imperial pursuits, the acquisition of land to which they had no natural right in other parts of the world, in many ways that competition had provided a ventilator and a neutralizer for continental conflicts. In many cases, states that were at loggerheads with each other could get out of a crisis by making mutual concessions in the sort of non-European space, which many of them did. And so that became, in some ways, imperialism is a factor in the disarming or the defusing of crises. The second point is one more point of principle, and that is that imperialism is such an ambient phenomenon. It's so omnipresent that it's very difficult to make it work as an explainer of any particular episode or action. Even Morocco is complicated in that respect because Morocco begins with the French effort to deepen and extend French control of Morocco against international law, but the German protest is in the name of international law and the open door policy. Is that an imperialist process? No, it's an opportunistic attempt to put the Franco-British agreement under the Entente, under pressure by calling the French out over their illegal behavior in Morocco. That's the German view of it. So is that imperialism or is it something else? It's complicated. And imperialism is there as a sort of background pressure, and it suggests a generally permissive attitude towards violence and confrontation. But it's unclear how to make that work as the cause of particular crises and also of particular modes of resolution in the pre-war.
Right. Now I want to ask you about the second set of counterfactuals, which is what you might call the domino version of this. Once the assassination does happen, a sequence of events play out over 5 weeks or so. Someone takes a step, which means someone else takes a step, which means someone else takes a step. And before you know it, the Germans are in Belgium, the British have joined the war, and the world is a different place. And could those steps have been avoided? Could someone have taken a different step? And it starts with the Austrians. So you've touched on this already. And part of the historiography here, post facto, is for some of the belligerents to blame the Austrians for overreacting, to turn this from a Balkan crisis into a crisis of Austrian, Austro-Hungarian, but particularly Austrian overreaction. They didn't need to blow this thing up. But there's another fascinating counterfactual, which you discuss in your book. On the one hand, the view is the Austrians were too hasty. They blundered in and they turned this into an international crisis. The other possibility is they weren't hasty enough. If they'd just gone straight in and not tried to line all their ducks up to make it a sort of official response with all the diplomatic niceties so that the ultimatum turns into a casus belli, and they just, as it were, done a punishment beating, it's possible that there would have been more tolerance of that as a sort of knee-jerk reaction. And the problem, in a way, is that they did exactly the thing that was going to make this thing blow up, which is they did escalate it, but they escalated it in quite a ponderous way, which gave everyone else time to get really pissed off with the fact that they were escalating it. So are there two possible routes that this might not have happened, either quicker or slower?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think that ponderous is absolutely the right word, because the Austro-Hungarian administration was nothing if not ponderous. It never did anything quickly if there was an alternative route which operated very, very slowly. So it was very slow off the mark. The process of deciding what to do about Serbia was agonizingly slow for everybody, but in particular for the Germans. And so, what we have at the very early in the crisis is the Austrians send a man called Hoyos up to Berlin to ask the Germans, will you back us if we decide we need to take precipitate action, even at the possible risk of an intervention by Russia or something like that? Would you back us? And the Germans say, well, we see that this is a very, very serious provocation, and we see that you need to do something. But the German view is, please act quickly. Let's resolve this as quickly as possible. And the Germans get more and more anxious about what's happening as each day passes, without any further news from Vienna. In the meanwhile, in Vienna, several hundred participants in the decision-making process are gradually sort of, forming a kind of consensus, but it takes a very long time. So yes, that is part of the problem, that the response was so slow, and that had several effects for it. It gave people time to frame in their own minds, people outside the Austro-German nexus, to frame this as an issue between the great powers rather than a Balkan crisis, because it gave everybody time to sort of harden a view on the question of what should happen next. There was no surprise effect. And secondly, it allowed the shock of the assassinations to wear off. The first response in many places was, oh my God, the Austrians are going to have to do something about this. What have those Serbs been up to? So that was the first response. And interestingly, the Romanian statesman, Brătianu, who met with Berchtold during the crisis, said, why didn't you just act straight away? If you'd just gone over 24 hours later or 48 hours later, sent an army into Belgrade, then that would have made all the difference. Everybody would have understood that. But because you waited, it looks like something premeditated. It looks like you have ulterior motives. It looks like this was cooked in a Berlin kitchen. This is the Germans behind this. So in other words, and of course, from the Austrian view, they thought, well, we're going to do things the right way, right? We're going to offer an ultimatum, right? We're going to explain what we need to happen and so on. And there's been a lot of discussion of whether the ultimatum was meant to actually succeed. And some people say, no, it was an unacceptable ultimatum. I mean, when you look at the ultimatum, you can see it is a very demanding ultimatum, but it's focused on the need for compliance. In other words, the Austrians say, not only must you stop doing this kind of irredentist activity, and not only must you arrest the people who are involved with all this plotting and planning, you must also allow Austrian officials to sit on the bodies that do this. In other words, they wanted some kind of oversight. Now, that is not in the context of, 21st century international relations in a situation of this kind, not an unreasonable demand. The problem was that it was being made in a situation where there were no supervening national bodies. There was no body or council that could have been entrusted with the task of making sure that Serbia actually does shut down its irredentist networks in Bosnia-Herzegovina, that they stop funding them, stop providing them with inflammatory literature, stop providing them with guns and grenades and so on. And so the Austrians felt, well, if we don't have any assurance of compliance, then a Serbian reply will be useless. And of course, that was the point on which the Serbs refused the ultimatum. That was the point on which the refusal was unequivocal. So it's a very complex situation. And the question of what the Austrians could have done differently is a difficult one because, the Austrians never did things quickly. They always did things slowly. And it was a very complex structure. It was a somewhat anomalous structure in the European setting of the time. The other point to bear in mind, I suppose, is, and this touches on a slightly different point, but it is that the act itself, the assassinations themselves, had already changed the chemistry of the discussion in Austria, because the most important spokesperson, the most important spokesman, I guess we can call him a man, for peace was in fact the Archduke, Franz Ferdinand. It was he who had always stood up. And when Konrad von Hötzendorf, the completely irresponsible and, insanely belligerent Martinet, chief of the general staff, when Hötzendorf urged war, as he did at every opportunity, that was his answer to everything. I've got a pain in my ankle. Have you tried waging war on Serbia? Every time Hötzendorf got into one of his sort of warmongering frenzies, Franz Ferdinand would stand up and shout him down. So Franz Ferdinand had been the one, the most stalwart friend of peace and a measured policy in the Balkans in particular. And he had said again and again, we don't want a single plum tree from Serbia. So that also is part of the complex rearrangement of options, the sort of narrowing of space around the decision-making process that takes place in Vienna after the assassinations.
If you would like to hear the second part of my conversation with Chris Clark, you will need to subscribe to PPF Plus. It's very easy. You just click on the link in the show description or go to ppfideas.com. Chris and I are talking in part 2, which will be out tomorrow, about what came next, how the Russians responded to the Austrians, how the Germans responded to the Russians, the French to the Germans, and the British too. We talk about all the different ways in which all of the major players maybe could have behaved differently and prevented this catastrophe. So to hear part 2, sign up to PPF Plus now. The next episode in this series, in our usual slot, is also about the consequences of the First World War, this time the Russian Revolution. I'm talking to the historian of Russia, Edward Acton, about how the Russian Revolution could have been different if it hadn't been a Bolshevik revolution. Who were the other revolutionaries and how, perhaps, could they have come out on top? Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.